You're listening to a Whales or Whales production.
You're also listening to Whales.
Visit whalesorwhales.com for more projects and shows like this one.
Greetings.
Hello everybody, welcome to Hearthaholics. This is part 2 of our beginner's guide, and today we are going to be focusing on deck archetypes. I am your host Brian, and joining me today is Andres. Hello Andres, how you doing?
Hey Brian, I'm doing pretty good. Coming out of a little cold, but I'm feeling good this morning. I'm well rested. I'm good to go.
I'm amazed that this episode is actually being recorded. It had a rough history. We're recording later than we intended. Andres had a cold, then you decided to take Alka-Seltzer, and we're out cold for like 12 hours.
Listen,
and
I
then
just want to give
a
a word of advice to all of our listeners. If you guys have something to do your next day, do not, I repeat, do not drink Alka-Seltzer cold nighttime. Because you will be knocked out for the next like 12 hours.
Yeah, that is actually more valuable than any advice we're going to give you about Hearthstone on this episode.
Yeah, this is life advice.
So if you leave with anything, leave with that. For people who missed our last episode and are used to the usual Hearthaholics format, we are doing a new format where we do a strategy workshop each week and really delve in depth on a strategic topic rather than covering like recent news or meta reports or what we've been up to in the game recently. And this week is part 2 of our beginner's guide series. You can find part 1 of it last week where we focused on the core concepts of Hearthstone, stuff like tempo, card advantage, etc. And this week we wanted to go over the different kind of deck archetypes that are in the game and where all the different popular decks fit into those archetypes. So hopefully this will give new players especially a place to start in terms of understanding kind of where decks fit in and what principles define different decks and how they're differentiated from one another. So anything you want to describe here on the top of the show, Andres, before we jump into the specific archetypes?
Sure. I just wanted to do a little quick PSA. We've been starting all this beginner guides, core concepts, deck archetypes, that whole thing. And we've gotten a lot of feedback for our first episode, and we are very happy for that. A lot of people seem to like the direction the new show is taking. Also, some other people freaked out a little bit. They're like, oh, are you guys going to start doing this from now on? I just want to say to those people, we're not going to be talking about mana crystals and resources until the end of time. This is a general guideline resource that we want to create so that later down the line, we have a resource that we can always point people towards. And It felt right to do at least the first 4 or so episodes, like introductory type, where we can go through all the core concepts. Today, we'll go through the deck archetypes, all that stuff. And then later move on to more in-depth sections of strategy. And we'll be covering still very current things. We'll be talking about things like the Patron nerf. We had some listeners that were interested in that sort of thing. We'll probably discuss that at the end of the show since we got a few emails in about that. So we'll touch on it. But yeah, I just wanted to touch on that. So for those people who have been listening to the show for a while and knew us before we started doing these guides, we're still going to be very much like that. These few episodes just tend to be like this while we get them out of the way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The main reason we're making this beginner's guide is so we have a resource for people to catch up to speed so that we can discuss more complex issues without having to worry about whether or not people know the fundamentals. This way, anyone coming to our podcast, we can always refer them to these fundamentals, and then they can understand the more complex discussions we can have going forward. And like you said, Andres, we can totally theme our future episodes around interesting current stuff. We just don't want our show to be a rundown of the news every week. We want to go more in depth than that. So
yeah, exactly. But if there's news worth discussing down the line, we definitely are willing to do it on the show. This deck is all about Hearthstone. We love everything Hearthstone. We want to center on the strategy, but
Exactly.
Strategy encompasses a lot of things.
Yeah, we could have made a whole episode around the Patron nerf, talking about nerfs and buffs in general and what the fallout of that was going to be. Just the timing happened to line up with we wanted to get this beginner's guide and consistently focus on it for the first few weeks.
Exactly.
So
And it's a change that we still have to see how it's going to unfold. We'll touch on it a little bit at the end of the show. But with that being said, I'd say let's kick it off.
Yeah, the last quick note I wanted to say is if there are just little things you want us to address that maybe aren't a whole episode, we do, starting this week, are going to have a listener mail segment at the end of each episode. So if you have any random topic or recent news you want us to cover that you don't think we're going to make an episode about, just send us in an email and we can talk about it for a few minutes at the end of the show. So
yeah, and keep the feedback coming. It's been great.
Yes.
I love hearing from all of you guys. What do you think about this type of shows and stuff?
Yeah, we got a lot of feedback in, and I really appreciate all of it. Especially the guy who emailed took time to listen to the episode multiple times to really give the best analysis he could. So that is
I'm
really
glad
appreciated.
if people can get this much out of these episodes, it makes me very happy.
Totally. All right, so here we go. Deck archetypes, Andres. What are they?
All right. So before we get started on deck archetypes, let's just touch on what is a deck archetype, right? Because before we start talking about them, why is it important to even know deck archetypes, so know why they exist? Basically, deck archetypes are a way that the community around TCGs or collectible card games have established to describe a certain kind of deck. And why this is important is because in a game like Hearthstone, where information and knowledge is everything, being able to categorize decks into surefire categories that you can instantly know what that deck might aim to do or the general playstyle of that deck is very important and is very useful to quickly, in just a few words, be able to pinpoint the specific characteristics of a deck that make it what it is.
Right. Like any classification system, it's a generalization and simplification that just helps. There's nothing about this that is true, in the way that Hearthstone does not say certain things are control decks or aggro decks in the game client at all. It's just a way for the community to create some general labels to put decks into so you understand what you're getting into and know a little more about the deck.
Exactly.
Going forward. It's all arbitrary, but it's kind of just agreed upon principles that we can have a starting point rather than just a random collection of 30 cards that have no connection between each other.
Exactly. And in games like Hearthstone or games like Magic the Gathering or just general card games, from the design standpoint, there's different approaches that the developers of this game have given the players on how to play the game. There's different approaches. You can win the game in different ways. And that is why this deck archetypes exist, because it basically describes the fashion in which a deck attempts to win.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the core point, especially when you're first playing a deck, because keeping in mind how you're actually going to win the game is probably the most valuable thing you can know about your deck.
Or your opponent's deck.
Yeah, totally. Stopping them from winning, knowing what they're going for, and thus knowing how to counter that, which we're going to be getting into.
Yep. All right. So let's get into it.
Yep. Speaking of winning.
That's right. The first archetype that we're going to touch on wins a lot. That is true. People see it a lot. That is because it's one of the most common and predominant archetypes in Hearthstone so far. And that is aggro.
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 So I guess aggro is short for aggressive.
Yep. Aggro is a short word for aggressive. I'm not sure exactly where the term was coined. Most of these terms, I believe, come from Magic the Gathering, since it's the long-standing TCG out there, starting in the 1990s. Yeah. And
aggro,
most of these concepts emerge with Magic as people learn the game a little better and try to set general guidelines and stuff so that they could understand the game better.
Exactly.
But most of them have kind of drifted over into the other collectible card games. So yeah, I think this is where it comes from. Don't quote me on it, but yes, I believe so.
Probably. My go-to answer for anything in Hearthstone is it came from Magic.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of it has.
It's a safe bet. I mean, the developers save themselves.
From poker and other stuff.
Yeah, that's true. Like Tilt. All right, so aggro. What defines an aggro deck, Andres? I'm assuming it's aggressive.
Yeah, so like the name says, aggro stands for aggressive. It's a deck that usually aims to use their cards as damage. Most of the cards in aggro decks just provide a ton of damage. Because of this, they favor a fast gameplay. They're usually aiming for a tempo-oriented gameplay, meaning that they want to get on the board quick, faster than the opponent, and they're not looking to prolong the game. They're looking to close out the game as soon as they could.
Yeah.
An aggro deck's dream would be to close out the game on turn 1. Obviously, this is not allowed because they'll be unfun for everyone.
Yeah.
But some aggro decks can get as fast as closing out the game by turn 5.
Yeah. Or if you get your opponent to concede even sooner.
Yeah, even sooner if you can get it to concede, which they actually do sometimes.
Yeah, totally. I think if you're thinking in terms of the kind of principles we introduced last week, aggro is a deck that very much relies on tempo in terms of getting a very fast start and keeping the pressure on your opponent. And it's a deck that's going to lose out in value typically and also in card advantage. So if you let the game go long with aggressive against a less aggressive deck, what's going to happen is your cards are going to be hurting them and taking down their health, but the cards aren't going to be as effective. They're typically, 1 mana, 2 mana, 3 mana cards. And once you get later in the game and your opponent is playing 4 mana and 5 mana cards and using their mana more efficiently for less cards, you're going to start to burn out, run out of cards. And if you can't kill them quick enough, they're going to take the game back with their more powerful cards, and you're not really going to have any recourse. So
exactly.
The important thing to keep in mind if the win condition is aggro is you have to win fast because you're going to lose that long game if you let things go.
You said it perfectly. This deck just generally favor tempo over card advantage and value because they just want to finish the game fast and is what they want to do.
Exactly. Face Hunter, most of you have probably heard of that deck. The most popular aggro example in Hearthstone right now. Gets a lot of hate because of that fact. I don't personally mind Face Hunter. I don't play it myself. But it is a deck that basically everything in the deck goes to directly hurt your opponent. The hero power for Hunter does 2 damage to your opponent. Every card you play does damage to your opponent. So you're just basically playing all of your cards to kill them as fast as possible. However, people, joke about how aggro decks are just go face the entire time. You don't worry about anything else. But sometimes there's a really key part where you are going to have to remove 1 or 2 minions from your opponent. Just because the scales are tipped heavily towards always go towards your opponent doesn't mean you never want to focus on your opponent's board, which I think makes those few decisions of when to control your opponent's board more important and more high stakes in aggro, which I think is a fact that's often missed.
When you're playing aggro decks, you're generally focusing on their life points. You generally have very finite resources because they're decks that don't pack a lot of card draw or that their cards are not going to gain a lot of value. Face Hunter is a great example to bring up because their cards hurt a lot. But their cards are not hard to remove. Like, they pack things like Leper Gnomes, which are 2/1s, very easily removed just by hero power, can be removed. So it's a card that can lose you card advantage really easily. Same with things like the Wolf Riders.
Yep, 3/1 to charge.
Yeah, that now have been changed for the Argent Horse Riders. Just because that Divine Shield actually prevents you from losing card advantage so easily. And
right. So that's same mana cost, 2/1 instead of 3/1, but it has Divine Shield. But you're right, that lets you live longer.
Exactly. You lose one damage, but the card kind of sticks a little longer. So it can overall give you more damage.
Right.
But yeah, basically it's cards that just have charge, that can attack really fast, can be removed really easily. So it's a deck that will lose steam quite fast. But it's also a deck that can deal a lot of damage really fast. But like you said, because it can run out of steam really fast, you have to be extremely efficient with your damage. And basically, you're aiming everything at the face, and anything that you have to divert away from face is has to be very strategic. You have to think about it. You have to think, if I deal 5 damage to this Belcher right now, am I going to have enough damage to close out the game? Or is my opponent going to be able to take over the board?
Right.
And am I going to run out of resources?
Right. Though Belcher is an interesting example because often in those cases, unless you have silence, you don't have a choice with taunt minions. And that's one of the big destroyers of aggro is taunt minions.
Yeah, taunt
Suddenly,
minions are
they
good
remove
against
your
aggro.
choice to go face.
Now that you said Belcher and taunt minions, aggro decks also run a lot of disruption effects.
Yep.
And you mentioned silence. Silence is a great example of a disruption effect. Mainly because they want to close out the game fast. They want to make their opponent have a hard time answering their things.
Right.
Silence is a great example of this. Since Belcher is such a great response to aggro, silence just neutralizes that defense and might leave your opponent with their pants down pretty much. And you can keep overwhelming them. Aggro decks, they want to do that. They want to overwhelm their opponent fast enough, and then they usually have disruption tools to keep him going, and then they usually pack a few closing out tools. Closing out tools can be things like Kill Command or Fireball, where regardless if your opponent hasn't been able to set up defenses, if you were able to bring them low enough, you can just directly close out the game with these type of cards.
Exactly. Aggro is the type of deck where you're planning more short term than long term. You don't want to think about, 5 turns down the line, how much value is that card going to get for them? You're just like, how quickly can I kill them before they're allowed to use what's powerful about their deck? And disruption effects help a ton of that.
Sorry, were you going to say anything else?
No, that's it. Go ahead.
Sure. I was just going to say also, aggro decks tend to favor really low mana curves because they want to be able to put a lot of pressure early on in the first few turns. To do this, they need to constantly draw into their lower end cards. So you want to be able to always have your 1-drop, 2-drop, 3-drop, that sort of thing. It's very dangerous for an aggro deck to not do anything on the first turn or two, because it might not be quick enough to kill their opponent before they can establish their defenses. So because of this, aggro decks tend to be, one, cheap in dust cost, just because you're using cheaper cards, smaller minions that just overwhelm the board. And also, they tend to fall off fairly quick. The value of these cards later on in the game is pretty bad. Like, drawing a Leper Gnome in turn 8 or turn 9 is quite devastating.
And that's probably, that leads to probably the thing that I've had the most trouble with aggro decks, which is that when you play an aggro deck, you need to be playing an incredibly risky style. Like, you can't say, oh, they might have a board wipe. I probably shouldn't play my minions. I should probably only play them 1 or 2 at a time, because what if they, remove my board and then I can't deal any damage? Because if you hesitate, you lose by default with aggressive decks. Which again isn't to say there's no subtlety in terms of removing minions or making non-aggressive plays, but you have to play so heavily skewed towards being risky, or else you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah, with aggro decks really favor those people that like asking the questions and like being the ones who are on the offensive side. They usually tend to have very short games as well, just because you're always trying to close out the game early. Usually if it gets past like turn 7 or 8, you've already lost the game, you concede and move on, or your opponent kills you. So generally these games don't go past turn 10, so people who like this type of playstyle tend to favor aggro.
Yeah, it's a concept that's also seen in most other strategy games. Using StarCraft as an example, there are like all-in strategies, which people just go all in and say, okay, I'm going to Zerg Rush. If this fails, I pretty much lose the game. But if it succeeds, then I pretty much win the game. That's what it is.
Same qualities.
That's
other decks, I was just going to say other decks that are kind of like in the same vein. The Aggro Paladin, the one that plays all the small minions with Blessing of Kings and like the Chargers.
You mean the one you never see anymore because it's a Secret Paladin?
Yeah, you don't see it anymore as much. I think it's still a pretty good deck.
It was really good before Secret.
For an aggro deck, it gets the job done. But now that Secret Paladin is here, it's kind of been kind of forgotten about.
Yep.
We also have Mech Shaman. Mech Shaman is a very effective aggro deck, but like other aggro decks, it lacks in the late game and is easily countered if you can get through the early game. But it's one of those decks that if it just gets the right start, no deck can stop it.
One of the big problems I think with Mech Shaman compared to something like Face Hunter is that it doesn't utilize what I think is the mechanic that makes Hearthstone, that makes aggro in Hearthstone so effective, which is charge. A lot of the damage in Mech Shaman is stuff that they have to keep on the board for a turn before it starts dealing damage, which is useful, but not as useful as stuff like Face Hunter, where the turn you play Wolf Rider, you're dealing damage to your opponent's face. And that's, I think, what makes it's something we've talked about earlier on the podcast, but something that makes aggro in general so effective in Hearthstone is, unlike Magic, your opponent can't choose to block your attack at any time with his creatures. Unless you have a taunt creature, you can choose to go face with every single creature every single time. So that becomes exceedingly powerful in Hearthstone, because every time you play a minion that has charge, or even the next turn if it doesn't, you can always attack your opponent's health. And that's something that isn't really seen in a lot of other TCGs, and is something that makes it extremely effective.
Yeah, absolutely. And
time.
I think it's a cool point that you just made there, because an aggro deck to another aggro deck might have slight differences. I would say probably Face Hunter is one of the fastest aggro decks out there, with just constantly putting damage out there. Mech Shaman, on the other hand, is not as fast in the way that it deals damage to the other player, but it packs a little bit more of a punch.
Oh yeah.
And with cards like Mech Warper, you can do really big tempo plays where you can unload a lot of creatures from your hand with higher cost. You kind of cheat the mana curve and just tempo them out into the battlefield. And these cards can hurt quite a bit. Especially when you're putting them out so early, your opponent might not have drawn or have enough mana to deal with them.
Yeah, there was that one tournament game where Firebat won with a Mech Shaman like on turn 2 or 3.
Yeah, with
that Wind Fury 3/2.
What's his name?
The Whirling Zap-O-Matic.
Whirling
And
Zap-O-Matic.
then he just threw a bunch of buffs on it for cheap and
the
just
Jedi.
destroyed it. Yep.
Have you ever seen the golden version of that card? With
with
the
the lightsabers. Yeah, it's amazing.
It's pretty cool.
I love that
So
card.
yeah, exactly. Decks like Mech Shaman can take the game like that, where like the cards can deal so much damage on their own, or cards like Fell Reaver, which can come out as soon as turn 4, an 8/8 for 4 mana if you have that coin.
I've been playing a ton of aggro druid recently, and if you can get out those large threats, the thing that's so potent about those threats like Fell Reaver is its cards, and that is an 8 attack, 8 health minion that whenever your opponent plays cards, it mills cards from your deck and discards them. But it's not a problem because you're finishing the game out so quickly. And what's so powerful about that is it's only 5 mana, especially if you can ramp it out with something like Druid. You're playing threats that the opponent just can't deal with yet. It doesn't have the mana or the cards to be able to effectively answer it. That's the kind of stuff that's supposed to come out late game. So that's another way you can be aggressive, is by getting stuff out earlier than it should be, even if it's giving you a penalty.
Fell Reaver is a good example of an aggro card, because you realize that you don't care about your late game, and that you're never gonna get to the bottom of your deck. You can risk playing things like Fell Reaver, which mill 3 cards out of your deck every time your opponent plays a card. You can lose so many cards in one turn.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that they can mill your entire deck. That Fell Reaver might still outright win you the game just by going base.
It's a good trainer on how to think about aggro, which is, it's literally destroying your late game before your very eyes. It's killing your value before your very eyes. It's like, that's how you have to think about it.
But as an aggro deck, you really don't care.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else on aggro decks, or should we move on?
No, I think that should do it. Make it pretty clear what it is.
Yep. All right. So after aggro, we have the opposite of aggro, and that is control. So, Andres, what are control decks?
That is right. Control is the opposite end of the spectrum. Basically, control decks want to slow the game down, and they usually do this by means, and just slow down the game by means of attrition, and then at the end, just pretty much get to a point where they just win the game because their opponent has run out of resources, and they can start deploying their more slow, powerful cards to finish things off.
Exactly. Opposite of, like, if you want to look at the mana curve to differentiate them, aggro wants, a bunch of 1 and 2 and 3 drops and that sort of thing, while control, because it plays a very defensive style of play, can typically spend its lower curve just stopping the opponent, and then it can actually beef up on a bunch of, 7, 8, 9 drops that it can drop in late game, and other decks that are less late game oriented just won't have effective answers to that.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, it's a game of attrition with control decks, and what I mean by this is you're trying to slowly grind down your opponent in effective ways, in ways that are good for you, and slowly over time, your opponent is going to have less and less options, while your options are gonna increase with control decks. Does the theory behind them? You want to slow the game down because the more that the game goes on and drags on, the better off you are, while your opponent is gonna be in a worse position. And control decks do this in a variety of ways. A very common thing to see in control decks is they aim to remove threats at a reduced cost or very efficiently. So you see them packing a lot of things like AoE spells. Control decks love things like Flame Strike, Hellfire, Shadow Flame, Brawl, Consecrate, Holy Nova, you name them. Anything that deals damage to a large amount of minions is great for a control deck because they can allow your opponent to overextend and then remove 3 or 4 cards in one soup.
Because if you're going to think about control decks similarly to how we put it in the core context of the core concepts for aggro in control decks, you don't really care about tempo at all for your own deck. Like you're not trying to build up minions over time. At least most control decks aren't. The only thing you care about tempo is reducing your opponent's tempo. What you care about much more is card advantage and value. And you're looking to, throughout the game, basically keep your opponent paralyzed while spending less cards than they are and spending less resources than they are, which in the late game is going to leave you with a handful of threats and them with nothing. Which is basically the concept. So yeah, threat removal at reduced cost is a fantastic way to get that.
Yeah, an idea of this is using very effective removal for big threats that your opponent might have. So examples of this are things like Big Game Hunter, Hex, Polymorph. This sort of cards can allow you to remove single very large threats in a very effective fashion. Again, neutralizing your opponent, extending the game, and keeping the resource balance on your favor rather than on theirs.
Yeah, anything time you can kill, a 7-8 mana creature with a 3 mana card, you're getting a lot of value there.
Yep. Another way that control decks do this, and this is a little more of an abstract concept, but it works really well. And once you realize this, you can really use this to your advantage. And is control decks tend to not play threats that can be answered. And what I mean by this is it's not that they play cards that have no answer to them, but rather they just play no cards. They're usually on a very reactive role. They're not putting out threats themselves. So other decks then might bring cards that are specifically aimed towards removing threats or controlling the board suddenly lose a ton of value because they have nothing to aim them at.
Yeah.
A good example of this is sometimes you can be playing with, let's say, an aggressive deck, and you're playing against a control deck. You deploy some of your creatures, and they're able to deal with them very effectively. Now you draw into your next turn, and you look at your hand, and your hand is looking like Fireball, Frostbolt, and maybe like Mirror Entities. All these cards can be good, but because you don't have any creatures to put on the board, they're just not necessarily good at that time. You don't really want to Fireball at their face and their Frostbolt because it's going to deal some damage, but it's not going to really affect the game in any significant way, right? You want to kind of save these cards till you can close out the game for good, or maybe use them to remove one of their creatures. But because they're not playing any creatures, suddenly you're looking at a turn where you have nothing to do.
Right. Or often the creatures they play get them value on their own. It's something like Acolyte of Pain, which draws them cards, or Armorsmith, which gains them armor. So it's creatures that even if they lose them, they're getting value from them, regardless.
Yeah, exactly. So this effectively gives the control player an advantage because by not playing things and making your opponent have dead cards, it can make him sometimes have really awkward or dead turns where they're not very effective and they might just pass the turn without doing anything significant, furthering the game plan of the control deck, which is just to get it to the end game as much as possible.
Exactly.
Another thing that control decks do really well is synergy disruption.
Yes.
Sometimes control decks don't need to necessarily deal with everything that their opponents have, but they just need to deal with the key cards that allow your opponent to do a lot of things. A lot of decks bring several cards that are very synergistic together, and that together create very powerful effects, but that by themselves are cards that are not very strong. So usually people don't want to play these cards just on their own. A good example for this, and a simple one, is in mech decks.
Mm-hmm.
Mech Warper is kind of like the centerpiece of a lot of mech decks, where
Right.
you can deploy your Mech Warper and then get a discount on your creatures. You can get ahead on the board.
Yep.
A good control player realizes this, and the second Mech Warper comes down, he kills it. And by killing Mech Warper, he doesn't necessarily have to deal with the rest of the opponent's creatures, but he has delayed his opponent, and his opponent is going to have to pace himself a little more by playing his creatures, giving the control player more time to deal with everything individually.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the thing that
yeah.
I mean by synergy disruption.
Totally. Control is a very precise style of play where you have to identify what your opponent's weaknesses are and use your resources to most effectively cripple them as you can. This is especially true in decks that rely on specific ways to win. Like every time you're going up against a deck with control, you want to analyze, okay, how does this deck win? Let's take Patron, for example, the deck that, you won't actually have to deal with anymore. But that would win, typically by frothing berserkers and grim patrons. So throughout the game, you would just want to think, okay, do I have cards that can deal with those threats? And as they play them, play those cards, slowly deal with those threats effectively. And once you take out the, 2 Warsong commanders they have to give their minions charge and the 2, frothing berserkers they have, they don't really have a win condition anymore. So just by destroying those, you can pretty much win the game and not have to worry too much about the other cards and potential threats they have. So that's something always to keep in mind is where not just, does this effectively kill this minion for a good cost, but is this the minion that will enable this deck to beat me? Is this where I need to be putting my pressure?
Exactly.
And always think like, okay, if they play Archmage Antonidas on turn 7, I need to have an Executor or Shield Slam or something that can deal with that if they play. You always want to be thinking about, keeping the right card around for the right circumstance, which comes, over time of knowing the other decks, which is one reason control decks are not typically good beginner decks, because they rely on knowing more of the metagame, I would say, than something like an aggro deck.
Yeah, control decks, just because they're in a more reactive role, they tend to be a little harder to play because you need to be a little better at allocating your removal and how you're gonna defend. Well, aggro decks, at least in the beginning stages, like once you get to the top end level of play, aggro decks sometimes are argued to be harder to play than control decks. But at least when you start playing Hearthstone, aggro decks have a more defined game plan, whereas like I'm just gonna go to their face. I'm just gonna kill them really quick. Control decks, at least when you're first starting out, really rely on you considering all your options and deciding, okay, can I do this now or should I save this later? Should I use this removal on this creature, or should I just try to play a creature and remove it with my creature? And it's basically a game of keeping yourself alive, and sometimes that can be a little harder to do if you don't necessarily know all the cards that your opponents might be playing.
Exactly. Like aggro decks, I think you can get further with an aggro deck without even worrying what deck your opponent is playing. Like you can basically play the same game plan.
Yeah, with aggro decks, you can sometimes ignore your opponent game's plan just because you're trying to close out the game so fast that you don't really have to worry about that.
Which is why people don't like it.
Yeah, with control decks, on the other hand, you're trying to get to the end of the game.
Yeah.
So you need to be able to understand your opponent's game plan so that you can counter it accordingly.
Which, again, I relate back to StarCraft. I could never play mid or late game in StarCraft because it required me to know so many more of the mechanics of the game than just rushing my opponent. Because you're just, by default, you're playing less of the game. So it's less stuff to have to know going into it.
I really hope that there is like a listener out there that loves StarCraft.
Yes!
Because I love your StarCraft analogies. They're always like spot on. They always like work really well. But
so many more people play Hearthstone than StarCraft. Like, yes!
Brian loves StarCraft.
I was terrible at StarCraft. Hearthstone is what I play because I can't play StarCraft.
There you go.
Yeah, I wonder how many people are like, man, I can master StarCraft, but Hearthstone, I just can't get into it.
There must be somebody out there.
Warcraft 3, that also works. Maybe there's some players from
very
that.
fun game.
All right.
All
So
right.
anything else on control decks?
I guess just a few examples of control decks common out there are Control Warrior, Handlock's a good example. Control Priest, like the Lime Bomb style that has a ton of removal. I'm talking not the Dragon Priest, but more of the traditional style.
Yeah, the old priest.
Yeah, with Circles of Healings and Akinai, Shadow Priest, all that stuff.
Yeah, those are... my personal favorite has always been Control Warrior. That's one of the first decks I ever played, but it's also a very expensive deck to play.
Control Warrior is probably like one of the purest control decks. But really, it just aims to stall the game for the longest time, has very, very efficient removal, and then it just has huge slow threats that deploys at the end of the game and stumps you over.
Yeah, it's probably the two control decks you're going to be seeing common in Hearthstone at this point is Control Warrior, which, just stalls the game out until they can play their finisher, which is typically like Grom and Alexstrasza, so reducing your opponent's health to 15 and then finishing them out with a super powerful charge minion. But Handlock is an interesting difference and kind of shows how Control can be a flexible style of play, and that Handlock also focuses around playing a lot of threats itself. It's just kind of later in the game.
A little later in the show, we'll get into this, because these are the main archetypes, but that doesn't mean that a deck can only be Control. Or that a deck can only be aggro. In fact, the lines are very blurred in Hearthstone. There's all sorts of things, and you can combine. You can have aggro control. You can have all these things, but we'll touch on that later.
Totally. But speaking of blurred lines, we have mid-range, which is kind of the definition of being a combination.
Mid-range decks. So originally, the mid-range archetype, especially coming from Magic, it's a hybrid archetype where people didn't consider it originally an archetype by itself. Right. But I feel like it's grown enough and it has enough characteristics that you can make it an archetype on its own right. Yeah. But pretty much mid-range decks lie somewhere in between aggro decks and control decks. They're a hybrid of both. Usually, the game plan of a mid-range deck consists of an early game where they try to control the board. They're not trying to get on the board as quick as possible, although some of these decks can. But unlike aggro, is not looking for so much speed in the beginning of the game, but more of a balanced control. And they're usually trying to set up for their mid-game.
If you were to differentiate aggro to mid-range's early game, is mid-range is the reason mid-range is playing an early game is not to deal damage typically, but to remove threats from the opponent and kind of control the board. For example, Zombie Chow, the 2-attack, 3-health creature that when it dies, it gives your opponent 5 health. Terrible in aggro because it's not getting you any damage done. Really good in mid-range because it can trade effectively with other 1-drop minions and other early minions while allowing you to build a presence.
Exactly. A key aspect of mid-range decks is that a lot of them tend to play cards in the early game that don't necessarily give him immediate value, but will give him value a few turns down the line. What I mean by this, and a good example of it, is, for example, mid-range Druid. Mid-range Druid aims to control the board early on with things like Wrath, Swipes, Keeper of the Grove, that sort of thing. But it also aims to set up into their mid-game with things like Wall Growth, Darnassus Aspirant, and even things like Innervate can help them do that.
Or Shade of Naxxramas, which literally gets stronger every turn.
Yeah, exactly. Shade of Naxxramas is a good example of that. A minion that you play early that you plan on not using until probably like turn 6 or 7, right? That's usually the cutoff point for mid-range decks. Usually around turn 5 or 6, you change your gears, and suddenly these decks start pumping out usually sizable threats. We have, for example, mid-range Hunter, which by turn 6 starts dropping Savannah Highmane, then into Dr. Boom. Some people even like sneaking a Ragnaros in there sometimes. Same with mid-range Druid. They start dropping Druid of the Claw, Sylvanas, Ancient
Belcher,
of Lore, that sort of things, like big guys that provide a lot of value and a big threat. So that's pretty much the concept of mid-range, Also, it's an interesting archetype because it's very flexible. Let's say against control decks, you can play more of an attrition-based game where you can slowly grind them down and then win with your bigger dudes down the line. And you can play a more aggressive game against control decks. So it can vary, right? It can play as a control deck sometimes. It can play as an aggro deck sometimes. Basically has characteristics of both.
That's the really cool thing about mid-range is if you queue up into the game and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm facing Face Hunter. All right. Well, the good thing about Face Hunter is if I can burn them out, I have a better late game than them. So, you play around removing their threats, keeping them neutralized, making them waste their cards, keeping yourself healthy, playing a lot of taunts, a lot of things that can control the early game. And then you're kind of good to go because you're just going to get more value out of your cards than they are from turn 5 onwards. Well, like you said, when facing a control deck, you queue up against something like Control Warrior, you're just like, okay, I have to kill them before they're allowed to get into their late game, before they're allowed to outvalue me. So suddenly you start using these same cards and the same deck, but you can be faster than your opponent. So that's kind of the cool thing about mid-range. Is like you said, it can adapt.
Also the other side of the coin to this, right? A mid-range deck, on the other hand, if it's facing an aggro deck, and the aggro deck is able to put the mid-range deck in a position where they have to race, the mid-range deck will usually be at a disadvantage because the pure aggro deck is usually faster, has more speed, and can close out the game a little faster just because it's more aimed to do that. Same with the control deck. If the control deck manages to get the mid-range deck into an attrition war, then the control deck will probably end up coming victorious just because the value of their cards is generally better. So it's kind of like a jack of all trades, right?
Exactly.
Like master of none.
Exactly. So the mid-range deck is one of the most consistent decks you can get, but it might not capitalize on weaknesses as much in the meta or just in general as much as other decks can. It's very consistent though. I mean, you see that in mid-range druid, which typically just doesn't go away. Like it gets a little bit better and a little bit worse, but it's always there. Like it's just really consistent and solid.
And there's another reason why, but we'll touch on that.
Yeah, that's true too.
A bit.
But yeah, it's one of my favorite archetypes. Mid-range paladin is probably the one I've gotten most into over time.
Let's say a few examples of this. Like you said, mid-range druid is a good example. Very strong minions, very good early game setup and ways to remove the board. We also have mid-range paladin, has a very solid game start with shielded mini bots. It can use muster for battle to control the early game really well, and then it gets quite strong once it gets to past like turn 6. You start dropping Sylvanas, Dr. Boom, Tyrion Forging. You also have things like Lay on Hands to keep you in the game and draw a little more cards, and then you can even turn your dudes into big 3/3s with your Quartermaster. Mid-range Hunter, a good example of that, is a deck that, unlike Face Hunter, is not aiming to go towards your face super fast in the beginning. On the other hand, it's trying to set up things for later on. A good example of setting up with the Hunter is instead of using explosive traps, they love using freezing traps.
Right.
Because this way, you can do things like freezing trap your opponent's Shredder and drop your own Shredder. Or freezing trap into your turn 5, coin out a high main. And then suddenly, your opponent is really behind and you're dropping your big mid-game threats.
Yeah, Hunter has a really good ability. I think one reason they work for mid-range is they have a really great ability to gain tempo at low cost. Like you said, Freezing Trap can come out of a Mad Scientist, which is a minion that lets you get a secret for free. So basically for free, you're putting minions back into your opponent's hand and making them cost more. Additionally, you can use stuff like Hunter's Mark, which costs 0 mana to reduce an opponent's minion's health to 1. You can play stuff like Savannah Highmane on turn 6, which is an incredibly threatening minion. So yeah, it's like it does pretty well at like gaining tempo and gaining value over the course of the game.
It also has tools, super good tools like Knife Juggling to unleash the hounds, which is devastating against aggro. Again, playing the attrition war where you can get rid of your opponent's cards with virtual knives that come out of nowhere.
That is the worst combo ever, though. I hate playing against that. But Dragon
Priest is a good example of a mid-range deck. You can control the board early on with your what's the name of the 2/4 with Tom?
Wormrest Accord?
Yeah,
Or not Accord, sorry, Wormrest Agent or something.
Wormrest Agent.
Yeah.
And then later on bringing your mid-range dragons, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's the type of mid-range play where you're just playing a good creature on every turn from 1 to 7, or 9 even. You're just continually playing threats.
Cool. So I think that covers it for mid-range decks.
Mid-range is a good example of just, it seems almost a little bit ambiguous because, these are just, it's kind of a merging of both styles we went over before. So it's right there in the middle. Something that kind of is on the outskirts of all of this, though, is combo decks. These are very specific types of decks.
Combo decks. Combo decks are super, super fun, in my opinion. Combo decks don't necessarily aim towards an aggro plan or a control plan. Combo decks just tend to find cards that work really, really well together. Combo decks are one of the funnest things for deck builders to invent or to come up with, because literally most not literally, but most common decks have found a combination of cards that stand on their own are not very powerful, but once you put them together, they can create an effect powerful enough to outright win you the game right there. So that's what basically they're trying to do. They're just trying to chain a bunch of cards together, create a really powerful effect, and take over. To do this type of decks value things like card value, consistency, and things like speed. You want card value because you want your cards to be able to stand on its ground long enough for you to draw into your combo. You want a consistent deck that can draw into your combo pieces consistently enough, right? You don't want to have 10 games where you just draw your combo once. You want to have 10 games where you draw your combo 8 out of 10 times.
Consistency is key for combo decks because you can find an amazing combo that requires like 5 cards that just outright wins you the game, but you're going to get that like 1 out of 50 games, so that's not a good deck.
And then the last point is speed. It's very crucial that you can draw into your combo fast enough before your opponent can kill you, because if not, then what are you even doing playing with this deck?
The win condition of a combo honestly consists of 2 things you have to do. So let's take a specific combo deck to provide some context here. We'll say Oil Rogue. That is a deck that relies on using Tinker Sharpsword Oil, which gives your weapon +3 attack as well as a random minion +3 attack at the same time, and then combining that with Blade Flurry, which destroys your weapon to deal your weapon's damage to your opponent's board and their face. This can be used as an amazing finisher because if you have a creature on the board, you can play Tinker Sharpsword Oil, buff up your weapon, buff up your creature, attack with your weapon, attack with your creature, and then Blade Flurry, which deals your weapon's damage to your opponent again. This can often do something like between 15 and 20 damage in one turn.
Yeah, sometimes it can outright do 30 damage. It can be that strong.
So the two aspects of winning with that deck, one is going to be, like you said, playing cards that can draw you in to that winning combo. And the second part is going to be making sure throughout the game you reduce your opponent's life enough that they get in range of that combo. So it's kind of those 2 aspects of, obviously, like you said, staying alive is the third part, controlling the board to do that. But basically, for your own win condition, you're looking to set up your opponent's life total to where it's in a position that you can kill them, and then set up your own hand in a position where you have the cards to kill them.
Yeah, exactly.
Every combo deck pretty much does that.
Yeah, every combo deck. I just want to center a little bit on the card value part of it.
Totally.
Because value is very important to this type of decks. Because you are sacrificing deck slots, or not deck slots, but card slots in your deck for this combo. And generally, these cards on their own are not very good. A good example of this is Patron Warrior. You just play a Patron by itself, just a 5 cost, 3/3, no more than that. It's not very good. It's easily for your opponents to remove by almost any creature or any spell, and you spent a ton of resources in it. But if you combine Patron Warrior with the old Warsong Commander and a ton of Whirlwind effects, suddenly you have a huge threat that is very, very, very hard to remove. To be able to do this, though, to be able to accomplish this and get away with putting cards in your deck that are not as valuable, you need to counteract that with cards that are very valuable. A good example of this is Patron Warrior also run things like Death Spite or Fiery War Axe, which are cards that can pack a ton of value into them, in the sense of one Fiery War Axe or one Death Spite can usually do a 2-for-1 for you. You can usually kill 2 creatures with 1 card. So this is the type of thing that I'm referring to. Oil Rogue does the same thing. Oil Rogue uses things, for example, like SI Agents, which can also give you easy 2-for-1s. Uses what's the name? Poison Blade?
Deadly Poison.
Deadly Poison, which is basically a Fiery War Axe. Once you equip your hero power, you Deadly Poison your weapon, and you can kill 2 creatures with that. So these are examples of card value that you need in a combo deck to be able to get away with putting cards that don't necessarily give you that much value, and that you might have to hold into your hand for a long time. So you want cards that can, deal with a lot of things.
That's a great point, because like you said, you're aiming to draw these combo pieces, so you want to draw them even early on in the game, but once they're in your hand, you're not going to play them pretty much until the end of the game or late in it, so they're just dead. You're right. The few cards that are playable in your hand need to give you a lot of longevity. They can't just be like Lepronome or something.
Exactly. Other examples of this is, for example, Freeze Mage. Freeze Mage uses things like Flame Strike and Blizzard, which are single cards that can net you a ton of value. It can remove a ton of things out of one soup. Yet another example of this. Very important in combo decks.
And because of all that, I think combo decks are probably the hardest deck to play, which is one reason people really liked Patron being in the game. Stuff like Oil Rogue and Patron and Freeze Mage are so difficult to play because you're having to predict the future very specifically. Often down to the point where you had to predict how much damage you can do with a combo that is by nature very variable. Patron relies on how many creatures are on the board. Oil Rogue relies on a ton of factors.
Yeah, combo decks are usually referred to as puzzle decks, where it feels like you're solving a puzzle when you're playing these decks, right? You have to do sometimes a ton of math. You have to calculate your percentages, because not only you're keeping track of your opponent's game plan, but you're also trying to keep track of when you're going to draw your combo. You have to be aware of how many cards are left in your deck. All these things that go in the background to machinate your plan.
And you also had to do things that are very counterintuitive in the moment, like you aren't gaining tempo or anything. It looks like you're playing a really bad game through most of the game.
Yeah, sometimes combo deck turns look really awkward just because you're trying to maybe cycle through your deck sometimes to draw into the right cards. And that brings me into the other part that is really important about tempo decks, and that is consistency. You definitely need to be able to draw into your combo super, super consistently. If not, then the deck is just not going to be good. If you're building your deck around a combo that you don't draw, then it's a bad deck.
Yeah.
To do this, though, to be able to be consistent with your decks, these decks usually employ fast or copious amounts of card draw or cycling through their deck.
So much. That's why the classes with the best card draw are often the classes that do combo decks.
To guarantee that they're going to end up with a combo in their hand, they just have to be able to draw as fast as possible. So back in the day, for example, one of the most prominent combo decks was Miracle Rogue.
Oh my gosh.
And Miracle Rogue, with the use of Gadgets and Actioneer, could
every
literally
time
draw
it cast
into
a
their
spell.
deck. Yeah.
Yes, every spell cast drew you a card, and rogues have a billion cheap spells.
Yeah, so they could draw through your entire deck, almost guaranteeing that the combo would end up in their hand. Patron Warrior has Battle Rage, which for every damaged minion allows you to draw a card, and if you have a full board of patrons that are also damaged with your Whirlwind, you can draw tons and tons of cards.
Patron Warrior also has the other way you can go about it, not only putting on card draw, but putting in multiple combos and multiple ways to get it. Patron has the patrons themselves, they have the war songs, and then they have the Frothing Berserkers. And these can be used in more than one combination to win.
Yeah, Patron actually has several combos that you can utilize, and that is super valid too. Actually, that just makes your deck stronger.
Yeah.
If your main combo can also divide itself into mini combos, or you can combo different cards together, that's even better. It's one of the reasons why Patron was so strong.
So the other way you can get card draw is by making the game go longer, because every single turn you're drawing a card. That's more of the strategy that Freeze Mage goes for. It has some card draw, but the thing that's so good about Freeze Mage is you can freeze your opponent's minions, you can put up ice barriers, you can put up ice blocks, and you can basically just make yourself into this invincible block of ice that's just stalling until the game ends.
Yeah, stalling is very key for combo decks.
Yeah. And that's what it relies on. Patron was so powerful because it was both a warrior, which could get a ton of armor, and also have a ton of card draw. So it had the best of all worlds as a combo deck.
And the last thing, speed, just to touch briefly on it. It's important that not only can you draw through your deck, but you can do this at a quick rate, right? You want to be able to get your combo pieces in your hand as fast as possible, because the longer you wait, the less chances you have of winning the game, right? Sometimes you get really unlucky and that last combo piece wasn't the last card and you just couldn't get to it. If you had just drawn into it, you would have won the game, but you didn't draw into it, so your opponent was able to close it out and you're dead.
Yes.
So very key. That's why the best combo decks usually employ things that sometimes even seem like exploits. Like Battle Rage sometimes seems like super unfair, where your opponent has a full board and then he draws like 6 cards. So huge amounts of cards in one turn, right? Or Miracle Rogue had the Gadget and just drawing even more cards at a very, very fast rate. Nowadays, rogues take care of that using things like preparation and sprint, which allows you to, by turn 4, draw 4 cards, which is quite a lot.
Yeah. And you may say, well, you're spending 2 cards to get 4, but in a combo deck, that's okay. You don't care about card advantage as much as you care about getting specific cards, which is it's a difference in the concept that's important to understand. Exactly. You're not just looking to generally have more value. You're looking, it's okay to spend any cards you have in your hand to be able to cycle through and get to those other cards. Like if you could make a 10-card combo deck instead of a 30-card deck, you would. That would be amazing. You can't, so you're stuck having to use
I think that covers it with combo decks.
All right, cool. That covers all of the primary types of decks out there. One thing I did want to touch on that I forgot about in Control is mill decks. I don't want to go in depth because they really aren't a part of Hearthstone right now. At least in terms of the primary metagame.
They are. They exist, right? They're not super popular, but you can make a mill deck. And we're not listing mill decks as an archetype here, mainly because I don't think they're an archetype on its own. They're just kind of a type of one of these archetypes.
They're Control, really.
So far, the ones that we have, because it can be different ones.
That's true. I guess you could have like an aggro mill deck.
You can have a combo mill deck.
Yeah, you're right. You could have that. I mean, basically what mill decks are looking to do, and you're right, in like Magic, there are some combos that like immediately mill your opponent's entire deck.
Yeah, exactly.
But in mill decks, what you're looking to do is basically make your opponent run out of cards by making them overdraw and draw a ton of cards. And in Hearthstone, once you have no cards, you start taking damage.
Yeah, but basically what that is, or right now in Hearthstone, the only types of mill decks that exist are control mill decks, where you are controlling the board, and then you try to make them draw cards, usually parallel to you. And then later on in the game, you just try to make him overdraw until they get into fatigue. Basically, this is just a control deck which accelerates the speed, at like the attrition speed at which it takes over the opponent.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. It's a faster control deck that's just like, all right, let's end this game by getting through both our decks really quickly. And some decks have cards that can really take advantage of that. Rogue is probably the most popular mill because of stuff like Vanish, which returns everything to their opponent's hand. In
games like Magic the Gathering, there are things like combo mill decks.
Yeah, you're right, totally.
Instead of trying to control you're still trying to control the board a little bit so you can draw into your combo. But basically, once you draw into your combo, you assemble the pieces, you lay it on the board, and you automatically usually mill all of your opponent's cards until they're dead. And Hearthstone, you can't really do that, mainly because I don't think they want that to be
you
a
to.
possibility.
They've been very careful with the mill cards they put in. Almost all of them are, what did you say? Parallel effects, where the same thing is happening to you that's happening to your opponent, which really limit them. Which is nice.
I guess the last thing I want to say on archetypes is that these are the main ones. Aggro, control, mid-range, and combo, I would say, are the most predominant ones.
Totally.
But like I said, these are just categories that help us identify what type of deck we're using or playing against, to give us kind of a sense of how we should be using the deck, right?
Yeah.
By knowing it's a aggro deck, then suddenly you know, I should be concentrating on tempo rather than a card advantage. If you know it's a control deck, you know, I should be concentrating on value and card advantage rather than tempo.
Yes.
And that sort of thing. But aside from that, in Hearthstone, there's only a few decks that you could call are just a pure aggro or a pure control. Most of them are actually like a combination of different things, and it's called hybrid strategies, where you have a deck that takes advantage of two different archetype characteristics. For example, you can have aggro control. An aggro control deck would be like a really aggressive deck with aggressive creatures that tries to deploy them quick, but it also carries tools with it to try to disrupt their opponent and try to slow them down. We usually call like tempo decks.
Right.
These decks, kind of like Tempo Mage, it would be probably like the most popular one out there right now. Just take advantage of deploying your board really early on and then disrupting your opponent in different ways. For example, Tempo Mage can use things like Sorcerer's Apprentice to get a lot of spells out quick. And you can do like Sorcerer's Apprentice into mirror entities. And then suddenly your opponent has to get through 2 taunt creatures before you can get to your other creatures.
Yeah.
So against, let's say, a control warrior that is equipping a Fire War Axe, this is a huge disruptive effect where he can get to the minions that he wants to get to. He has to get through your mirror entities first.
Yeah, it's that idea of simultaneously playing creatures while removing your opponent's creatures as well with cheap stuff like Frostbolt. It's a really cool style of play.
Yeah,
it's like
it has things, for
both things at
example,
once.
like Flame Waker. Flame Waker is a great card for an aggro control deck because it allows you to control the board while simultaneously being aggressive. An example of this is if you're playing against, let's say, a paladin or a hunter, you can play in Flame Waker and then like coin out mirror entities or coin out arcane missiles. This kind of play both is a tempo play because you're putting a creature on the board and removing their creatures more than likely. Yeah. And on top of that, you're probably dealing some damage to the face. Yeah. So you're kind of doing the control and the aggro both at the same time with this type of creature.
Totally. Another type there is control combo. And that's a little bit similar to combo in general, like we were talking about with Patron and so on. But it's a combo deck that focuses on that idea of removing the opponent's board and keeping it under control while you're playing it with a quick finisher.
Control combo is a cool little thing because it's a deck that plays like a control deck. And you can usually win the attrition war, but also packs a combo in it that can draw into it and deploy as needed. A good example of this kind of deck is the old Leroy Faceless Handlock, where you played as a handlock, but you had Leroy Jenkins Faceless Manipulator in there to help you close out the game.
And the double power overwhelming.
Oh, and double power overwhelming, yeah. So you just make like a 14 attack Leroy and clone
and then copy it.
Yeah, and then deal like copious amounts of damage. So it's an example of that kind of deck.
Yeah, just to show, like, again, how much these decks bleed into each other. Control Warrior could be a control combo deck if you think about how it finishes. It finishes with a Grom Alexstrasza combo, typically. So even Control Warrior kind of falls into control combo.
Yeah, it has although the Alexstrasza Grom, I don't know if I would necessarily consider that like a combo, like a true combo, because I feel like true combos are a sequence of cards that you want to play kind of like together, right?
Sure.
kind of like in the same turn, like a 2-turn thing. It's
Well, like Freeze Mage is kind of 2-turn, which is why it's weird.
Yeah.
It's Alex draws it
Yeah,
into cards.
yeah,
So again, it's hard. Like, you're going to
yeah,
be able to pick these apart.
You're right. The lines tend to get blurred a lot.
Totally.
For example, a very common deck that I feel is like very in between is the aggressive mid-range druid.
Yep.
That deck is what you could consider an aggro combo deck,
Mhm.
where even like a mid-range aggro combo deck, where you're using mana ramps early on to get on the board quite fast, and you can overwhelm your opponent and just outright kill with your creatures. But you also have a combo finisher that you can draw into with your like Ancients of Lore and that sort of thing. That is the infamous Force of Nature and Savage Roar combo. As long as you can
14
get him to
damage.
14 health, and you can finish him out with your combo.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting, it's just basically the principle of, you have aggro, you have control, and you have combo. You have the idea of being aggressive, you have the idea of controlling the board, and you have the idea of playing a specific set of decks to win quickly. And then you combine those to get different decks. Like even mid-range is a combination of those 3 factors, or sometimes at times those 2 factors. So, I guess the last one would be aggro control combo.
I mean, there can be a million of these combinations, but yeah, just to give an example, like aggro control combo, you're gonna say like, what are you talking about in the world?
You're just putting random words together.
But like an example of a deck that could do this, for example, is the traditional mid-range shaman. They can have aggressive starts where it can fill the board with like zombie chow, totems, and flame tongue, and then be packing a punch or the new totem golem, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But it also has combo-like tools with Hex, Lightning Storm, Earth Shock,
Or control.
this sort of thing. Yeah. Sorry, control. Where it can go toe-to-toe in the attrition war with somebody else.
Yeah.
And then it has combo-like finishers. Sometimes they put in like Alakir with Flame Tongue and Rock Biter for like 15 damage or more in one turn.
Yep, or the Doom Hammer.
Yeah, Doom Hammer, Rock Biter sort of thing.
Same thing, just using Wind Fury and Charge to deal like 18 damage in one turn. Which is
so
really...
this deck has like a little bit of everything, for example.
Yeah. Again, it's kind of a jack of all trades in its own right, except it's like a mid-range deck that throws in a combo, which a lot of mid-range decks don't have. It's a really powerful combo that can just finish it out in one turn. And it's just yet another style of play. So as you can see, archetypes are just a mindset. The most helpful thing they can help you do is just determine what your win condition is. But as you learn more about the game and find more decks, you see that, they really are just labels, and most decks bleed between them and go beyond them. But
Yeah, that's just what they are, labels, categories, if you will. They just help us get a sense of what we're playing against or what we're playing with. They're great, for example, once you've been playing the game for a while and somebody brings you a new deck and they tell you, hey man, check this deck out. It's a aggro deck with a combo finisher. Then you instantly can know like, oh, okay, then if I take this list and I play with myself, this is how I should probably be approaching the playstyle of the deck.
Yep.
Or if you're playing against another deck and you know it's a control deck, then suddenly you know what their game plan is probably going to be about.
Yeah, and you can just, give them advice like, oh, this is an aggro deck. Okay, maybe don't include so many 8-drops. Like it gives you a place to start to generally know what sort of cards to put in what sort of deck rather than just saying, okay, I have 30 cards. What the heck do I put in there? So it's like, it gives you an idea of the win conditions, both of you.
But just like colors, there's black, there's white, and then there's everything in between.
Yep, exactly. So black is Face Hunter. White is Control Warrior, and you have everything in between.
Cool. All right. I think that this does it for deck archetype talk. Hope you guys enjoyed that.
Yeah, definitely. Let us know if there's anything you want us to cover or add to that, or any questions. Speaking of which, we have our first listener mail segment.
Woo!
First of all, I wanted to start off with a very quick note from Matt, and he writes, as a newish player who sucks, what is the best archetype to start building towards? And I love the show. Well, I appreciate that very much.
Thank you, Matt.
Luckily, that is exactly what we're going to be going into next week. Next week's episode is going to be about both kind of mindsets when playing, bad mindsets to fall into, good mindsets to keep track of. and just kind of how to think about the game when playing it competitively, especially on ladder, which can be very frustrating and stressful for a lot of people. And secondly, we're going to be focusing on, since it's the end of our 3-part beginner's guide, we're going to kind of give people a launching off point of saying, okay, now that you have this knowledge, how should you tackle ladder? What's a good rank to shoot for? What are good decks to try? And kind of create a little package for people to be able to go off into the ranked constructed world and do their worst or best, depending on how you think of it. So we're going to be going over that in detail, but Andres, we can give them a couple quick answers now. Like, what do you think are good beginner decks based on what we
absolutely.
talked
I
about
would
today?
say best archetype to just outright start. I would say it's probably aggro. No questions asked. Because of a couple of factors. Like we said before, aggro decks usually tend to be on the lower end of the curve, meaning that most of the cards that go into aggro decks are cheaper, just by default. So these are decks that are usually easier to build when you're starting your collection and that sort of thing. And they're also decks that, although can get really complex down the line, especially as you learn the game a little more and your opponents get a little more tough, it's also one of the archetypes that has one of the simplest game plans. You're not trying to come up with elaborate puzzles and things like that while playing the game. It's a very, very dedicated mindset of, I'm gonna go to the face and try to kill them as quick as possible.
Right.
So grasping that concept is a little easier in the beginning as you learn all the cards and become more acquainted with the game. That sort of thing. What do you think?
I think, aggro is good. Like, Face Hunter, very easy to build, very obvious one. I wouldn't stay just playing that for too long, because while it does teach you an aspect of the game, it really doesn't give you a breadth of knowledge about playing the game. But it is a good place to start. Aggro Paladin, that's pretty cheap as well, correct? I can't think of many, like...
Aggro
epics,
Paladin as well.
Yeah, epics or legendaries that go into that one.
Also, not to dismerit aggro decks, but mid-range decks can also be a good place to start.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Mid-range decks tend to be a little more balanced. You're not so much all into these things. Mid-range decks sometimes are a little more expensive to craft, since they use a little better minions sometimes. Like, a lot of them include things like Dr. Boom, or they include things like the Belcher, which sometimes require you to have the adventures and that sort of thing. But mid-range decks can also be really fun, just because sometimes with mid-range decks, you don't feel like you're so constricted by your game plan, meaning that sometimes you can play more of the value game, you can try to trade more. Sometimes you get to play with a little bit of combos and that sort of thing on these decks. So like mid-range Druid, I would say mid-range Hunter would probably be one of the best decks to look into if you're starting to play the game.
That's a good suggestion. The one I probably gravitated towards was Zulok, because it combines a lot of the type of aggro play, which is playing creatures quickly, but also gets you into more of the board control mindset and, keeping control of the game. I loved Zulok.
Zulok is a great deck to practice and get your fundamentals, especially like your trading and that sort of thing down. Because it's a very board-centric type of deck. Nowadays, it has become more of that like Demon Zoo. But it's still very, very powerful.
Yeah, I prefer Demon Zoo because it's a little more mid-gamey, and I just find it more fun because you get to play stuff like Bane of Doom and Melganis and just play out crazy stuff. But if you want to start really budget, there are some old classic Zulok decks that are that run like Dark Iron Dwarves and are a lot more focused on, basic cards and getting just cheap and effective creatures on the board quickly. So I'll see if I can find a few deck lists for you to get started with. I think Zulok, great place to start.
Mid-range Hunter, I would also recommend.
Mid-range Hunter, Aggro Paladin, and Face Hunter.
If you're on a budget.
I think all four of those would be great. In case like Matt was listening and was like, Control sounds amazing. What do you think is like the best budget control deck? Like the most budget control deck you could make?
The most budget-oriented control deck, huh?
And just easy to learn.
I would say
Priest?
Priest would probably be one of the cheapest ones, just because the control deck uses a lot of the basic cards that come with the Priest class.
Priest is
already.
a control class.
Yeah. Although I don't know if it would be the easiest to learn, but
it's
if you're set on control, then that would probably be the cheapest one to start. If money is not a problem, go for Control Warrior. But I don't know. If you're just starting out the game, I would probably not recommend doing that huge of an investment. on a deck like
Agreed.
that, because you might be like me, and you might get Control Warrior and then realize that you actually don't enjoy the playstyle of Control Warrior because it's too slow for you.
Yeah. And just stay away from combo for now. Don't do combo decks starting out.
Well, combo decks are at a weird spot right now. Like, you can do Freeze Mage, which is arguably one of the hardest decks to play.
Yeah.
Or you can do Oil Rogue, which is
another
pretty hard to play, but it's in a good spot. Like, both of them can do really good. Yeah. If you're looking for a challenge and want to get into combo decks, probably Oil.
Yeah, I like Oil Rogue right now. That's a good place to start. So yeah, we'll be going more in depth about that next week, but hopefully that helped you out a little, Matt, and gave you a preview for that. Our second email comes from Jamie. It's the one we referenced earlier talking about the Patron nerfs. So I took an excerpt from his email, which I'll read here real quick. And Jamie writes, "Hi guys, just listened to the latest episode you guys put out. I'm not sure I like it in its current state. To explain, I'm one of those news junkies and development nerds that really love conversation and really enjoy it when naturally a long talk is had about a converse subject. The expectation I was really hoping for was that the recent breaking news about Warsong was definitely worth talking about and discussing what developments could come of this and what you should know about going into the unknown world. I know that seems more like the old format, but I definitely feel there was a good long discussion in there about what cards will be usable, what you can do to counter that stuff, what will become powerful, etc. That, like we'd addressed at the top of the show, very good feedback. We're not going to be doing beginner's guides forever. In fact, we just have one more episode of that. But it unfortunately came at the time that was right when the Patron nerf hit, which, yes, would have made a fantastic episode to really delve in deep on that. So,
to be honest, the Patron nerf came in kind of unexpectedly, right?
Oh, yeah.
They just came out of nowhere, like, all right, we're nerfing it.
So yeah, the Patron nerf. Let's just give it a few minutes here. Like, Andres, what did you think of it?
All right, let's talk about the Patron nerf. Let's address the elephant in the room.
It's like every podcast is literally obligated to talk about the Patron nerf.
Pretty much.
I think it is a buff to Bloodlust Shaman. I don't know.
Hey, you don't know.
Probably
it
is. You can play more Haunted Creepers now.
It is, yeah. It's definitely not bad for the Shaman archetype.
That's true.
Or not archetype, but class.
All right, so I want to start here. We've been talking a lot, very, what would you say, high-mindedly and very objectively about the game. Do you like that they nerfed it? Like, just subjectively, do you think that was a good decision?
I liked Patron Warrior. I'm just going to put that out there. I liked Patron Warrior. I was a fan of the deck. I preferred it over Control Warrior.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was a challenging deck to play. I didn't encounter it that much on the ladder. I found it every 1 out of 10 games or something like that. Although in the higher end, it would arguably be more predominant. Having said that, though, I feel like it was necessary for the game.
Yeah.
I think that for this game to continue moving forward, this had to be done. Because the Patron nerf, or more likely the Warsong Commander nerf, was not just a nerf. It was an outright, this card is never going to be played again.
Right.
Basically, Warsong Commander is worse than Raid Leader now. It costs the same mana, you get 1 more health, but the effect only affects charged minions, which are just worse. A very selected few. And they're not that good by themselves, you know what I mean?
Exactly.
You don't want to be playing a deck full of charged minions, basically.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree. I mean, they removed the card from competitive play, which
this is basically
fine.
What they did to Starving Buzzard back in the day.
They tend to do this.
I feel like the reason when they do this, when they finally do decide to nerf a card, because they're not fan of nerfing cards. They prefer. It
took
not
a long
to do
time.
Yeah, as long as they can avoid it, they are. But when they do it, they have destroyed this card. Same with Starving Buzzard. They made it into an unplayable 3/2 that nobody plays anymore because it's just not very good. And the reason they do this is because they're cards that warp the meta a little bit too much. And not only currently, but in the future as well. There are cards that really hinder design philosophy or design in general for this game. Having cards like Warsong Commander was probably causing a lot of in-house problems with new sets or new cards that they wanted to put out, because now they have to keep in mind, okay, we have Warsong Commander that has this effect on warriors, so any card that has 3 or less attack can become quite a problem
It's why they didn't give Dreadsteed as a neutral card, going back to some stuff that Ben Brode said. Like, Dreadsteed was going to be a neutral card, and they're like, oh, wait, Warsong, no.
Yeah, there you go. That is a perfect example of what can happen. So I think they just wanted to eliminate the problem from the root and be like, guys, let's just not worry about this down the line. Let's just take it out of the picture, and we can keep designing and iterating the game in a lot of different new ways that Warsong Commander was not allowing us to do.
So, first of all, I would say everyone check out Ben Brode put out a video explaining it. So if you want to hear like why they did it, you don't need our speculation. They've said, and they have the reasoning. You can agree with it or you can disagree with it. But I'm glad that Blizzard addressed that pretty soon after they released the nerf. My personal thoughts about nerfs in general. I read an article, I don't know if you saw it, on Liquid Hearth that Titular Celestial wrote. And he was just very, very angry about the nerf in general. He very much didn't like it. There, of course, is some language barrier, so he might have not made his point as artfully as he intended to. But it kind of came off to me as a rant that I've kind of seen as a sentiment in other places as well. Just talking about how much Blizzard is ruining the game and how it kind of came across as Blizzard doesn't have a right to mess with stuff that the community comes up with, because the community comes up with interesting decks and then they ruin it. And my thought of that is, we've talked a lot about cycling, taking cards out of rotation over time like Magic does. If Blizzard does not institute that, and they currently don't have that type of thing, they have no control over their game if they can't nerf it. If they were pulling cards out of cycle, like routinely, like, 2 expansions from now, we're literally taking Grim Patron out of competitive play, so it's no longer going to be a thing. Or, take Warsong out of competitive play, so it's no longer going to be a thing. I'd be like, yeah, maybe don't change the cards after the fact then. But because cards are around to stay literally forever in every format, they have to be able to change them, because you can't expect them to know every possible permutation that's going to happen to every card. Like, that's just not allowing them enough development control.
It's pretty much impossible to account for all possibilities in a game like this. I'm sure they have a dedicated team of very capable people, but even all the in-house testing is not going to be enough to predict all the possibilities that could happen, right?
Right.
You can't account for how these cards are going to play out or not. And they have to try out new things, right? They have to try to push the boundaries to keep the game being interesting, right? If they come up with a new expansion and none of the cards in that expansion are powerful or interesting enough for people to want to add them to the existing decks, then it would be a huge bummer for the entire community.
Right.
In order to keep doing this, though, sometimes you create cards that do a little better than you expect them to, and there's no way that you could have predicted it. Because of this, I think nerfing, although it should be kept to a minimum, is absolutely necessary sometimes. And just like Patron Warrior came into being, down the line, some crazy other decks can come into being. But for that to happen, maybe Patron had to die.
Yep, I agree with that. It was limiting the game in 2 ways, like you said. One way was the giving things charge all the time. The second way, or future card charge, and the second way was promoting an OTK style of play, which they've traditionally been very quick to stop, because that's not the fun part of Hearthstone. It's kind of abusing the charge mechanic. An interesting question that I like that people bring up is, was there a way for them to edit the deck without, going this drastic? Like, do you think the level of nerf they did, rather than just the concept of the nerf in general, was good?
I think they went really drastic this time, because they've tried the half measure approach before, and we've all seen how that worked out.
Unleash the hounds, unleash the hounds, unleash the hounds.
They nerfed the card, like 4 times? 3 times?
I think 3 or 4, yep.
So, yeah, rather than like having to go back and forth with these cards, they just do it from the get-go now and be like, okay, just not going to worry about this.
Yeah.
But yeah, another interesting thing that they did it was, when they did it, a month before the World Championship?
Yeah, that was crazy to me, that they're going to make all the pros find new strategies for the actual World Championship.
I think that was very much intended. I don't think that was very deliberate, And I think they did that is because in the past couple of big tournaments, we've seen like everybody brings Patron Warrior or at least counter to Patron Warrior.
Yeah.
So it's a deck that is very expected, and I feel like, in one way or another, it makes it less interesting for the viewers because the viewers kind of already know what's gonna happen. They know like, oh, they're gonna bring Patron, and this guy's gonna bring an anti-Patron kind of thing. And one of the coolest things in Hearthstone is when you're watching a competitive match and the guy pulls out a crazy deck or like a crazy tech that you haven't seen before and gets a win because of it. Like, I remember one of my favorite tournament experiences was when I was watching the ESL match between Brian Kibler and Dark Wanix. And Dark Wanix just pulls out the craziest Warlock combo deck with like Baron Geddon and a bunch of like other crazy stuff.
Wait, Baron Geddon and Warlock?
Yeah, Baron Geddon, and he had like...
Wait a minute, that's a warrior card.
Yeah, I know. And
Warlock?
It's a neutral card.
Wait, Baron Geddon's neutral? Oh,
Yeah.
you're right. I totally
It only
forgot.
gets played in Warrior.
I
but it's
literally
neutral.
thought he was a warrior card.
No, he's neutral.
I'm like, you must have meant warrior. That's hilarious.
No,
okay,
no.
so Baron Geddon.
Yeah, Baron Geddon. And he played like, what's the 8-cost card that gets rid of everything?
Twisting Nether.
Twisting Nether, yeah.
Jeez.
He played like some crazy things, and it caught Brian Kibler completely by surprise, and he ended up taking this win. And it was amazing. It was cool. It was awesome watching that. And I feel like in order to have those moments again, we can have decks that are just so strong that it's not worth bringing anything else.
Because you have to, like, you can't play Baron Geddon because he deals 2 damage to everything. Like, it just, like, limits.
Perfect example. Baron Geddon thrown out the window because of Patron.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think Patron was getting to defining it. And then, again, I just stand by the fact that, Blizzard, let them have some creative control over their game. If they can't cycle their cards out and these cards are around forever, I think they need to be able to have some amount of...
Having said that, I can definitely relate to those players that are upset about it because whether or not Warzone Commander was warping the game a little too much, Patron arguably was the hardest deck to play in this game, next to like Freeze Mage or something like that. It required a lot of planning and thought, and it really, really rewarded the players that were really good at the game.
I agree. Yeah, that is the one aspect I am very sad to see go, even as someone who didn't play a lot of Patron. I hope that we'll have that again in the future, and I think we will. But it is, in the short term, sad to see that gone, because I totally get why that was healthy for the game.
We'll see how things evolve now. Some of the decks that the Patron was bringing down are definitely going to be more predominant, like Face Hunter is definitely coming back. I have already seen 1 million of them in the ladder.
So yeah, I'm terrible at predicting meta, but I'm curious your thoughts. Like, what do you think is the fallout of the Patron? Because that's like the big talk everywhere. It's like, what's going to be the key? It's a power vacuum principle. So like, what will the power vacuum lead to?
Yeah. If I just have to do some like quick predictions and stuff, because it's too hard. I don't think the meta is gonna change that wildly. Although you never know. You never know.
Yeah,
something crazy might happen. But I don't think the meta is that unstable now. Patron was there, but I don't think it was causing that much of trouble outside from tournament play.
Yeah.
But having said that, I think Face Hunter is definitely gonna make a resurgence on the ladder. Secret Paladin seems really strong right now because one of the matchups he'd struggle against was Patron Warrior, but that is out of the way, and the rest of his matchups are actually quite good. So you could see Secret Paladin being a really big thing, continue being one of the top decks for a while now. And Handlock might see a slight decrease. Just because Handlock was so popular because patrons were around. And now that Face Hunter is coming up, Handlocks kind of hate Face Hunters. So that would be kind of like my prediction. Handlock goes down a little bit. Secret Paladin gets a little stronger. Face Hunter makes a resurgence.
Yeah. As always, I'm rooting for mid-range Paladin, Control Warrior, and mid-range Zoo, just because those are my 3 favorite decks. So we'll see how those fare. I can see Paladin getting back, especially with Murloc.
Zoo might not be a bad choice now, since like a quick Zoo, because Face Hunter can also get rid of Zoo. But now that Patron is gone, it might be quite good too.
Yeah. All right. Last question comes in from me, which I just thought of, which is, we were talking about all the archetypes before. Which one do you think Secret Paladin fits into?
Secret Paladin.
Is that?
I would say Secret Paladin is the state that it is in right now. It's probably a mid-range.
Yeah, I agree with you because like it has, we were talking earlier about how mid-range, once you get to at turn 6, you're playing 6, 7, 8, and that's like the staple of Secret Paladin. Is it plays Mysterious Challenger, Dr. Boom, Tyrion, and then that's how it curves out. And then early on, it's establishing board control with stuff like shielded bot.
It's a mid-range deck. With huge tempo swings. Basically, Mysterious Challenger is that. It's an incredible tempo swing over on your side. And it's mid-range in the sense that at the beginning of the game, you're trying to establish your presence on the board by really strong minions like Shielded Minibot, a bunch of like Divine Shields, Cog Hammer, that sort of thing. Into very, very strong mid-game. And you're just trying to set up for that turn 6 Mysterious Challenger. If you can play Mysterious Challenger while you have a board, usually the tempo gain is usually enough to win you the game from that point on. Even if your opponent can read every secret right and can respond to them accordingly, usually they've spent too many resources and too much time just trying to get rid of that. To the point where you're too far ahead and you can close out the game at that point. So it's like a tempo mid-range deck.
Yep, I agree. All right, that'll do it for listener mail then, which is hard to say. I'm going to have to think about that for future episodes. We also got some iTunes reviews. I finally checked the Canadian iTunes store. I never thought they'd do that until yesterday.
Do we have any reviews in it?
We do. We have
nice.
2, and we know them both. Anthony from the Game Nights, we've seen him there a lot. He says, balances hardcore with casual and give us 5 stars. I appreciate that. He says, an awesome podcast that's a treat to listen to for more casual players. 2 smorks way up. So thank you for that, Anthony.
Thanks, Anthony.
Then we also got one from Eve, fellow Hearthstone podcaster. Check out her new Hearthstone podcast, Villains Chosen, where they focus very much on budget game decks and the recent meta and how to kind of climb ladder, especially from like ranks 20 to 5. And she wrote, loved the change, 5 stars. I listened to the latest episode and was so inspired. Excellent for new players, very concise, easy to understand, yet in-depth and thought-provoking at the same time. Keep up the good work. I can't wait for the next episode. And she was talking, that was our first part of the beginner's guide. So I really appreciated that feedback.
Awesome, Eve. Thanks so much.
And let's see here. I think we got a few more also from the, US iTunes store. I actually had to go back a bit for these because we didn't cover reviews last week, but we got one from Dragon Rider DK, who is also like all over Twitter and other, Hearthstone podcasts. She recently did guested on an episode of, I think it was Top Deck Kings. I think I have that name right. Which is a fellow, I'm actually looking at it now to make sure, a fellow Hearthstone podcast that did an episode about all other Hearthstone podcasts, which was really cool.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Check that out.
So they covered ours along with everyone else's, and that was nice. And she guested on that one. So that was a really cool way to kind of bring everyone together. And she let us review. I'm sad it's over, 5 stars. Each episode gives me so much to think about. I just don't want it to end. Been a listener since the beginning and it has continuously gotten better. That was awesome.
Fantastic.
And we got 2 more. One from Peaks Binge Watcher who says, love the podcast, 5 stars. And another from Dire Bear who says, great podcast, 5 stars. So thank you everyone for those reviews. If you have access to iTunes and like the show, definitely keep them coming and let us know what you think of the new format.
Yeah, absolutely. We are welcoming all feedback right now, trying out this new format. Let us know what you think. Let us know if you guys want us to cover anything else that we haven't covered so far. I mean, we're just starting with this guide, but basically want to go in depth into all these strategy topics. Right now, we're just covering the basics. But once we start getting into more advanced stuff, please let us know what you guys would like to hear about. We can talk about specific decks. We can talk about the ladder. Hopefully, we'll be covering tournament play and maybe arena play later on. We're preparing some stuff for that. So, yeah.
Totally. Yeah, the doors are going to be
coming.
The doors are going to be wide open after these next couple episodes. So yeah, start sending in ideas for episodes now because we're going to start using them. Speaking of which, if you want to email us stuff, email us at hearthaholics@gmail.com. We're on Twitter, YouTube, Facebook as Hearthaholics. and we are a member of the Whales Are Whales network. So check out Whales Are Whales. That's Whales, A-R-E, whales.com for more other awesome podcasts like this with other awesome people like us. And finally, we do a game night, or actually game nights now for the Angry Chicken, fellow Hearthstone podcast. You can find their subreddit at /TAC podcast. And there we have actually sticky posts now, both for Monday game night, which Andres runs, a more competitive focused game night at 6:30 p.m. Central Daily Time every Monday. And that is, you guys are currently still doing that ATLC format, right? Where you do the team league?
Well, we're still doing it like that. I don't know. I think we're gonna keep that for now. It's just working really well, and it's really fun. Divided into 2 different teams, and you get to participate in your team, and it gets competitive. It's really fun.
Yeah, it's like real tournament practice. Unlike the Wednesday game nights, where we do Tavern Brawl pretty much the entire time. I run those. It's at 8 p.m. Central Daily Time every Wednesday. And man, was this last Tavern Brawl amazing. One of the best we've had in a very long time.
Oh, yeah. This Tavern Brawl was really fun.
The boss hero powers.
Yeah. Oh, my God. Yeah. I picked Druid, and I had a bunch of ramp spells. Oh,
it's amazing. Druid is amazing. If you could Astral Communion.
I think there was one turn which I just hero powered 4 times in a row.
Yes.
And it was enough to be a really good turn.
My new strategy for that is playing that priest card where every time you play your hero power, it deals 4 damage to both players and just try to aggro out.
Oh, that's awesome. Nice.
Ridiculous amounts of damage. So anyway, yeah, that'll be it. You can find that on the TAC subreddit, and it's the Angry Chicken. And let's see here. That's it. You can find me on Twitter at Lord Meldor. Oh my gosh, my dogs are barking. One sec.
No.
So close. All right. You can find me at Lord Meldor that's LORDMELDORR. And you can find Andres on Twitter at I Play Games. That's IPLAI Games. Our intro music, intro and outro music is done by Andres and his studio massevemusic.com. So check out MASSEVE the URL. I need to make sure I have that correct. What's the URL for that? Yes, it is Massive Music.
Yeah. Massmusic.com. You got it right.
EVEmusic.com, and you can find all the stuff he makes. He makes a bunch of music for like YouTube and Twitch and anything you want to license cool, like sci-fi cinematic music for. He's got you covered. So really awesome.
Absolutely. Come check it out.
Yeah. And that'll be it. Thank you, everyone. We will talk to you next week.
Let the hunt begin.